Hello sociologists, welcome to the next video in the sequence, and this one's a bit different. We've done enough work now that I can actually get you to practice applying what you have learned. So we've learnt about the how you choose a study and the various things that go into that. We've talked about positivists, and we've talked about interpretivists. We'll come back to those. We've talked about why you might choose certain things based on pet. So you might be imagining a bunch of pets because that's the joke I keep pushing. So there is practicality, the ethics and the theoretical considerations to take into account. Now there are more. We're also talking about things like validity. We're talking about things like repeatability. We're talking about things like brain's gone. Not rationality. Oh, it's gone. Repeatability, I've already said that. That's what I said. But basically, there are other things to take into account, and I haven't gone into too much detail on those just yet. Don't worry, there is a fun way of doing things. Now, this video, therefore, is about applying what we have learned to our very first attempt at an exam-based question. Now, remember, this isn't paper 2. Usually I'm here talking about paper 2 and Miss Wibbly's here talking about paper 2. But here in lockdown, and we were always planning this, we've got an extra lesson a week that we were then going to turn over. Well, effectively, I mean, obviously it's all lessons a week. We're going to turn over to talk about the end of paper 1. We're going to talk about research methods, which is what all this is about. And research methods appears in paper 1, so it's mainly about edumacation. Now, I'm going to need your help on this one, but I am going to be marking it. And, let's move straight on. So, on the screen right now is the file that I've put on the Show My Homework task that this video is attached to, or rather, the link to the video is attached to. And we're going to talk about using what you've learned in an item. Now, if you look at this, you've got the standard 20-mark question setup. You've got an item to use, and it's the same for paper 2, and you've got a question. It says, applying material from item C and your knowledge of research methods, evaluate the strengths and limitations of using field experiments to investigate the effects of teachers' labelling of pupils. The item is there to kickstart your knowledge, to give you an idea about what the examiner expects you to apply. And in this particular item, I noticed that the first bit is about a reminder of what labelling is, and the second thing is a hint about what sort of research methods you might use. Now, they've asked you to use field experiments, which is the work you just did, admittedly without input, from the textbook. So you've created your own set of notes on that. But you also know a little bit about PET. And you also know, rather a lot, about the research context, the more general processes of schools. Now, the labelling theory bit, that relies on your notes. I have not taught you that. That's not turned up in research methods. That is down there already from your work on edumacation with Mr. Cuthbert. So you'd have to apply that to this. Now, the easiest way of doing this is to basically go through PET. You go through practicality, you go through ethics, you go through theoretical. Now later I will teach you more letters. You could bring in validity, we've talked about that already. You can bring in repeatability, we've talked about that already. And there's another E, isn't there, but I can't remember what it is. I think that's in brackets. There's only the second R, which for some reason I just can't remember what it is off the top of my head. Don't worry, you don't need it for this. You can just get away with PET. In other words, you end up with a 3-paragraph structure to answer this question. And in this particular instance, it won't always work. In this particular instance, you can get away with going practicality, the theory, and ethics, because they fit. Which is why this is the 2017 paper, in case you're wondering. Now, what I've got, that won't work, but that will. What I've got here is the mark scheme that goes with it. So if you look at the second 2 slides on the PowerPoint that's been attached, you will find that that same question with the same item turns up. So the only reason I've got that first slide is to show you what it would look like in an exam paper. Underneath it, there'd be lines for you to write on, but I want you to get a feel for the look of things. This is what the mark scheme looks like. The question is exactly the same, though bizarrely it's formatted into a weird table at the top of the page there. And then beneath that, you've got the item, so the examiner can see the item. And then beneath that, you've got the mark scheme. Now you'll note that the mark scheme, and if I flick onto the next page there, has a grand total of 5 bands, like you're used to in a 20-mark question in paper 2 that we've been practicing quite recently. So in that sense, This is similar. You're going to have 3 paragraphs that each lead on to the next one. Each paragraph will cover 2 sides, a plus point and a critique of that, or a counterpoint, an evaluation if you will, and then you wrap it all up in a nice neat bow with a conclusion. And at the top level here, it actually gives you an idea about what you should be focused on in that answer. Now, you'll forgive me, I've got another screen open so I can see what I'm talking about as well, so I'm going to keep looking over. Wait, it's that way for me, and it's also that way for you. So I guess I'm looking the right way. Isn't that handy? So let's look at this. We can see it together here. And it says that, basically, you can see the answer in this span will show accurate, conceptually detailed knowledge and sound understanding of a range of relevant material. Hence, 3 points. Appropriate material will be applied accurately and with sensitivity to the investigation of the specific issue of the effects of teachers' labelling of pupils. You will apply directly what you know about field experiments to labelling. At the end of the day, all of your points will be rooted in that knowledge of teacher labelling. You have got to know your stuff. You can't talk more generally. You can't bring in examples from other areas of educational theory. You've got to focus on labelling, and all your examples are from labelling, which is why the item focuses on what labelling is and kind of hints at those examples, because otherwise it's really hard to bring them in. It then says students will apply knowledge of a range of relevant strengths and limitations of using field experiments to research issues and characteristics relating to the effects of teachers' labelling of pupils. These may include some of the following and or other relevant concerns. Now, these are hints. You do not have to use these. For future reference, I will not be sharing the mark scheme every single time, and you'll see why. It can be rather limiting, and it's based on what the examiner thinks is a good idea to include. These are generally written in a hurry. They're generally written by an examiner who has been writing multiple papers. You only ever see one of them, but they'll write 4 or 5 papers so that they don't know which one's going to be used, and they've got to come up with, generally speaking, off the top of their heads. They don't have very limited time. It's 2 weeks, I think, to write one of these, or 4 of these, and so it's a hodgepodge of whatever's on the top of their minds. These can be helpful, or they can get in the way of things. So I'll talk you through them today, but don't feel you have to use these points. You're welcome to use whatever you think is relevant based on what you have learned and what you feel you can use most effectively to answer the question. In this instance, the examiner has said the following: the research characteristics of potential research subjects, e.g. individual pupils, peer groups, teachers, the research context and settings, e.g. classrooms, staff rooms or school premises. The sensitivity of researching the effects of teachers' labelling of pupils, e.g. policy and resource implications for schools, schools markets and league table positions, its impact on achievement or behaviour, stigmatisation or parental consent. Aha! So basically what you've got to do is you've got to bring in knowledge of teacher labelling, and you've got to know what that means, and then you've got to put that in the context of what we were talking about with all those different areas. So I gave you 5 areas: parents, classrooms, schools, teachers, pupils. And you should be able to bring those in under the headings of practicality, ethics, theoretical considerations. And you should be able to arrange those under those headings. But there are other ways of doing things. You're saying, well, so actually, I want to talk about teachers, pupils, and classrooms, and do it that way. And that will be my 3 paragraphs. And I say, thank you, rhetorical device. That is a perfectly acceptable way of doing things, and there's nothing wrong with it. As long as each paragraph has on the one hand, and on the other hand, a point that supports it and an evaluation of that point. It doesn't matter what those 3 points are, provided you cover labelling, and all your examples are drawn from that, or linked to that. So all that stuff I told you about the context of a school, you apply to labelling and why that would be easier or harder to research through field experiments. And provided you use the practical, ethical and theoretical considerations. They don't all have to be used in the same paragraph, don't worry about that. But you bring them in at some point to talk about why field experiments are good or bad. Now, I seem to recall that validity was part of the field experiments call, and I haven't mentioned validity apart from in passing. You can use validity. It was one of the headings, I think, that you had. You might use the Hawthorne effect, for example, in a bit more detail. And therefore, you write your 3 paragraphs with an introduction and a conclusion. That's it. That's how we go. Now, there are other levels. There they are. I'm not going to tarry there. You've seen how to hit the top level. It doesn't really matter if you don't hit it the first time round, but I figure giving you the idea of how to hit that top level is more important than explaining what you need to get between 1 and 4 marks, because even if you hit that, you want to know how to improve. That's the theory. All of which brings me back to the idea of writing a 20-mark essay, and it doesn't change regardless of paper you're writing it for. It's exactly the same as what we've been discussing when we've been discussing family and households. It's exactly the same. You've got your introduction, your 3 main paragraphs, 4 if you've got an extra one, and if you want to put in an extra one if you're doing PET, but you're bringing in validity as an extra paragraph, or you're doing pupils, classrooms, schools and teachers, that would be acceptable too. And you can do 4. Aim for 4, write 3 if you're doing it in time conditions. So this is the first time you're doing it, so don't worry too much. 3 really good ones or 4 ones that you think, basically you're going through going, don't think this works with my 3, add a 4th. If you're going through it going, that's a lot of work for 3, don't do a 4th. It's fine, and we'll see whether it works. And you need a conclusion where you bring it all back to the question and say, okay, are field experiments a good use or a good method to use, rather, to investigate labelling? Why or why not? Where's the weight of the evidence lie? Don't worry, you don't have to come down totally on one side either, just a little bit. Don't sit on the fence, you get splinters. The final point I'm going to make is this idea about the academic passive. I keep banging on about it. Please don't say things like I believe or I think or in my opinion. These are unnecessary. Ideally, you write as an academic, and this is important. It gives your words power, weight, and heft. It makes it more you than writing I. Saying things like I think or I believe or in my opinion weakens your argument because you're automatically putting doubt in the reader's mind because they might disagree with you. If you write in the academic voice and say things like it is clear that, or the weight of the evidence suggests, or therefore it can be seen, it makes it sound like this is a pre-reached conclusion. It makes it more likely that someone reading your words will take you as a font of knowledge rather than as a flawed person with an opinion. Your opinion is fine, you just don't refer to it as your opinion. You refer to it as if it were correct, because to all intents and purposes, it is. You might say, well, sir, that makes me sound a little bit arrogant. I'm just a sixth form student. I don't know. And I say, well, you do, actually. You've been studying this topic, and you should be pleased and proud of what you have achieved. And as a consequence, you really ought to be pushing that as the right answer. And when you've had 2 years of this, you will get used to it. So please avoid I, and if necessary, go back and check. I realise it's an unnatural way of writing until you get used to it. I got used to it relatively quickly, but I'm just going to say that. I didn't know at the time, but I'm just going to point to the mug. You guys might take longer to get used to it, and that's fine, but it is a very powerful tool, and it will absolutely transform your answers from being potential answers to being convincing answers, and often that is what pushes you up within a band. Although it's not written directly into the mark scheme, that's what examiners are looking for. They're looking to be convinced. They're looking to be convinced that you know what you're talking about and that you know how to apply it. And so the more tricks of the trade, in this case the academic voice, we use, the better. I'm banging on about it because I noticed in the last responses a lot of people were struggling with it and they were still slipping into the I think or in my opinion. And so I'm banging on about it in an effort to try and just make sure that we're all on the same page. Hopefully this has been helpful and will support you in answering the questions. And also will be something you can refer back to after you've had a think. So if you want to come back to this video and start from the beginning, please feel free. And just go backwards and forwards, as ever. So the remaining time of this lesson, obviously this video isn't an hour in length, the remaining time in this lesson will be to go over, to annotate that item, and to start thinking about preparing your answer. The homework will be to complete that, and as usual, there will be a week. There's always a week. So whenever this is set for your set, you have a week from this date to submit that work. And that's it, basically. Thank you if you have been for watching. Have a lovely rest of day. Stay safe out there, and bye-bye now.